like to call on Chris Castro, who is the City of Orlando's Community Energy Manager, to introduce our next speaker. Chris.
Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here, and thank you so much for the introduction. Today I have the pleasure of inviting and introducing our next guest speaker, John "Skip" Leitner. John comes to us with more than 40 years of involvement in the environmental, energy, and economic policy arenas. He's a resource economist who leads a team of consultants at his own firm, the Economic and Human Dimensions Research Associates, based in Tucson, Arizona. He previously worked almost 10 years as a senior economist for technology policy with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. He left the federal service in June 2006 to focus his research on developing robust technology and behavioral characterizations of energy efficiency resources for use in energy and climate policy analysis and within economic policy models. Skip has authored more than 300 reports, journal articles, and book chapters, as well as collaborated with the best-selling author Jeremy Rifkin in writing The Third Industrial Revolution. His expertise includes benefit cost analysis, behavioral assessments, resource costs and constraints, and the net employment and macroeconomic impacts of energy and climate policy scenarios. In addition, Skip has been invited to provide technical seminars in diverse places around the world, including Australia, Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, nearly every single continent. His clients have ranged from the United Nations and the Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration to San Diego County, the U.S. Department of Energy, and corresponding national labs. We are so excited and pleased to have Skip join us and to hear what he has to say about the opportunities presented by taking climate action here in Orlando. Without further ado, Skip Leitner.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I'm so delighted to be here, and as you've just learned, unlike Mayor Dyer, Senator Nelson, I'm not a leader, I'm an economist. But hopefully, with an inquisitive mind, there still may be some things to share with you that may provide you some surprising insights and certainly some opportunities I think we can move ahead on. And as I'm thinking about this summit already, beginning to investigate some of the good works that's being done with the Greenworks Orlando, some of the excellent work of the city staff, Chris, John, Braden, and others, I've been quite intrigued the amount of learning and the amount of excitement is already beginning to emerge. I've learned, for example, just recently, every time I've landed Orlando, where the heck do the initials MCO come from? Well, I finally solved that mystery, McCoy Air Force Base, right? And I've learned similarly that Disney located its operations in Orlando in part to get away from hurricanes. It was sufficiently inland to prevent that exposure, but as we just learned from Peter, that may no longer be a viable operation. And I've learned that Floridians, and we'll talk about this in just a minute, Floridians are paying more for state-generated taxes, or excuse me, paying more for energy in the state of Florida. All the various ways we spend money on energy, transportation, utilities, heating our homes, powering our industries, more for energy than they are for state taxes. We worry so much about taxes. If we only put that same level of concern to work in energy, we might actually begin to think differently. And there are huge health effects that are typically not appreciated or evaluated. So many different elements I'm beginning to learn already just by talking to people here in Orlando and beginning to explore the good things you're already doing. And as I'm thinking about this thing we call energy, let me begin with this opening thought. Drawn from my work with friends in chemistry. You simply cannot trust atoms. They make up everything. And it's true, atoms do actually make up everything. They need a minimum amount of energy to retain the function and the form of the elements and the products that we need. If there's not enough energy to hold them together, they're going to easily dissipate, fly off, and become something entirely different that we may not want. On the other hand, too much energy, and especially wasted energy, they migrate into other things like heavy toxic metals, other forms of pollution. All of these things that impose huge costs. You can't trust them, but we darn well better understand them, and we don't. And I'm hopefully here today to begin digging a little deeper with you and how to think about my conversation. In fact, Mayor Dyer has already suggested a conversation is exactly the right word. So the beginning and the continuation of a conversation, dig a little deeper into a better understanding of what's really at work we talk about the economic imperative of energy efficiency. In this case, as an economist, moving from a stressed to a more robust, vibrant, and more resilient Orlando economy. Well, with that backdrop, I want to get a little sense of the audience here today. How to appreciate what your perspective is. I'm going to shape my talk a little bit as we might imagine what you might understand. And so let me ask a couple of questions. I want to get a sense from all of you what your general awareness of energy technology perspectives might look like. I want you to raise your hand as I pose a few questions, give me some idea here. And depending on responses, I'll try to shape the balance of my talk accordingly. First, I think generally there is familiar knowledge, but raise your hand if you know that Louis Pasteur first gained fame by developing the technique to pasteurize milk. People familiar with that? Oh, good. All right. We have a seemingly educated audience here. And most of you are undoubtedly aware of Henry Ford, right? Raise your hand if you know that he's also the brilliant innovator behind the assembly line production. People know this? Ah, all right. And finally, next, raise your hand if you are aware, maybe you can believe easily, that dynamite contains more energy than a kilogram of food, say hamburgers or chocolate chip cookies. People? Okay. And finally, and not necessarily that you're going to like the prospect of more coal in our future, but raise your hand if you're generally aware that at current prices there are at least 200 years of coal reserves, if not more, that are available for development or use. People believe that? Okay. Now I'm going to ask you, how would you feel to learn that every time you raised your hand you were wrong? And that's the way we need to rethink this energy question. Well, let's start off. Pasteur actually in 1876 wrote a paper. You're going to smile when I say this, I think. Studies on fermentation, the diseases of beer, the causes and the means of preventing them. In fact, Louis Pasteur gained insights about germs and the way to prevent diseases within beer through pasteurization. Only then later did he apply that to milk. Right? And similarly, Ford was a brilliant man. But his brilliance, his genius was actually to understand that in order to sell more cars, you had to bring the price of cars down. He adapted the assembly line ideas of Michael Owens, who was the innovator behind the bottling machine done a decade earlier, bottling for beer, I might add. Beer has been more important to our civilization than we imagine. Yes, yes. And it turns out that hamburger and cookies have more energy than dynamite per kilogram. But dynamite has the capacity to release that energy more quickly, and we sometimes confuse the two. Beer, I'm happy to say, actually has less energy than kilogram cookies. And yes, we have 200 years of coal, but not at current prices. Prices of coal, price of oil are going to go up dramatically if we even begin to imagine that we want to use these resources. And in order to understand that, we need to think about moving much more efficiently in order to really take advantage and maintain a robust economy. So in that sense, I'm going to draw on the spirit and the tradition of Nobel laureate and former Caltech physicist Richard Feynman. In 1959, he gave an incredible talk that has shaped my thinking about the physical economic world we live in. 1959, plenty of room at the bottom. In 1959, before computers were common, he stepped back and said, I can imagine storing the entire Encyclopedia Britannica on the head of a pin. And it was that visionary stepping back and asking better questions that paved the way for many of the ideas we begin to see maturing now, whether nanotechnologies, whether microelectronics, what have you. I provided the website. I think these slides will be up there. It's an amazing talk, not a single equation in it. It's hugely literate. I recommend it because it's that kind of stepping back, re-examining what is really available and possible in the world that will allow us to move forward. So let me give you some further opening perspectives. The productivity benefits from my colleague Jeremy Rifkin calls the second industrial revolution technologies, for the most part those technologies that we now rely heavily on, those productivity benefits are diminishing. They're still there, but they're getting weaker and weaker and weaker. My own research and the evidence clearly suggests that among the biggest reasons for diminishing returns is the inefficient use of resources, water, materials, but especially the inefficient use of energy. I think you'll be surprised. A social economic transformation is clearly needed to sustain our economy. Yes, to come to grips with the climate issue, absolutely, but we're going to have a weaker and weaker economy that will not have the financial resources to resolve and deal with the climate issues, or the education problem, or the healthcare problems, unless we have a robust economy. So a need for purposeful effort that includes directed actions such as Greenworks Orlando, and targeted investments that drive efficiency upgrades big time. In short, energy efficiency can provide, I suggest, a critical link between today's lagging economy and tomorrow's more robust future, if we step back, ask questions, and if we exercise the leadership that allows us to take action. All of that efficiency comes through what we call the energy stresses that affect the dynamic of our economy. We have jobs, certainly, structure of the economy, energy costs, but those rising energy costs, the volatility of energy prices, the disruption in energy supply, migrate in different ways that weaken local jobs, weaken economic activity, and the productivity of the larger economy. And why is this the case? This next slide, I think, underscores it. These are a slide by two of my colleagues who are quick sketch artists. They are in Germany. I gave a talk last year in Zurich, and they did this sketch when I suggested that the U.S. economy, from a work standpoint, the ability to convert matter into useful goods and services from start to finish, is only 14% energy efficient. And imagine, as this stick figure is trying to do, carrying the 86% burden of waste. You cannot be agile, you cannot be productive, you cannot be nimble if you're burdened by that incredible amount of inefficiency. And that is one of the things that's stymieing our ability to move ahead more robustly. And to give you some comparisons, I've put together an index comparing the United States in 2009, its overall energy intensity. And the good news is Florida is better off than the U.S. as a whole. But if you look downward, beginning with Sweden, Hong Kong, Europe, down to New Jersey, and California, Luxembourg, and New York, and other states, way far to go. But the bad news is we need to be headed to a substantial reduction in overall intensity if we're going to imagine any kind of a robust economy whatsoever. That's the task ahead of us. Now here's some numbers I drew on. This is for the Orlando metropolitan area, greater Orlando area. And now I'm looking at interesting numbers here. I'm looking at the historical period, data if you will, 1970 up to about 2013 where the green line is. And then we're projecting forward, building in some work my colleagues at Woods and Poole do, projecting the Orlando economy. This is per capita GDP. I think that's a measure of the overall productivity of the economy. Early years, you can see the wild and woolly nature of the economy bouncing up. A lot of that's got to do with resources and the prices that affect the decisions made and the actions taken. But generally, you can see we're starting up from a 4% down to a 3% and looking forward to maybe a 1% productivity growth. A slumping economy. That difference in the next 3 decades means that Orlando may lose the ability to create as many as 200,000 jobs on average. And what I'm suggesting is not unique to Orlando whatsoever. There is also a similar pattern within the U.S. and within the OECD nations, the developed nations, and even the developing nations of the world. A similar pattern because it is the inefficient use of resources, and especially energy, that constrains a much more robust economy. It imposes costs that we pay directly. We're not always aware of them, but it absolutely constrains the ability to move ahead the economy. And in that same regard, I want to offer that comparison of state-generated taxes to state energy expenditures. I need to update this, but 2011 data. And look at Florida. You pay about $33 billion a year for what the legislature approves as taxes in various forms, excise taxes, income taxes, the whole kit and caboodle. But for energy expenditures, for transportation, heating the home, powering industries, $68 billion. We ask hard questions. Are we taxing too much? Are we efficiently using tax dollars? If we would apply that same perspective, something even deeper, I think you begin to imagine there may be a greater economic opportunity than worrying as much as we do about taxes. Not that it's an unimportant issue, but a bigger issue for the well-being of Florida. But another take on it. Look at the number of jobs for the different sectors of the Orlando economy. These are Orlando data for 2010, the latest I could get. The larger Orlando metropolitan area. Utilities, energy services on average, directly and indirectly, for every $1 million spent on energy, about 5 jobs. Compare that to construction, where we get 17 jobs. The average manufacturing in the area, about 10.7 jobs. Trade and services, about 16 jobs. 10.9 jobs for household spending. In other words, as we can cost effectively migrate the inefficient use of energy to a productive use of energy, reducing energy bills and allow those dollars to be spent on something different, we're beginning to bolster almost immediately the jobs. So in the spirit of Albert Einstein, he was known for what he called his Gedankenexperimenten, thought experiments. I did this for Orlando. As an economist, I am simply laying out in such ways as Feynman might have done, asking better questions. Turns out that my estimates suggest that the larger Orlando area, again the metropolitan area, spends about $8 billion a year on energy. $8 billion, it's about 9% of your gross regional product. That's a lot of money. And I've asked the question, what if the city encouraged cost-effective efficiency investments to reduce those energy bills by 30%? That might save, obviously, simple math, $2.4 billion a year. But then taking thus comparisons of spending money on things other than energy, redirecting those dollars to other places in the economy, we might imagine that combination of investment and the resulting energy bill savings might support, just from that alone, 13,000 jobs for local businesses and residences. I actually think it's going to be a lot bigger because the robustness of the economy will provide the need for other jobs to be supported. But even more critically, in many ways, that 30% reduction in energy might avoid $300 to $700 million in annual health care costs, including the prevention of 40 to 90 adult mortalities a year. In other words, we have a cleaner air, it affects people in an easier way, and we're avoiding those premature deaths. As part of the calculus, part of that larger context we need to explore. And here's actually, as an economist, yes, I have to throw you a couple of graphs here more, but I think in many ways this is the most important slide of the talk, so forgive me. And I'm going to show you on the vertical axis here energy expenditures. I last gave this talk in Europe, so I'm using euros, but it doesn't matter, it could be US dollars, it doesn't really matter. And then I'm saying we now, at some point in time, spend what I call the cost of energy services. That includes the total cost of energy, but also the social, economic, environmental, health costs. All of those costs as a result of using energy very inefficiently right now. Our job is to say, well, we actually need to spend more money on policy and program expenses. We need to spend more money on investment expenditures for tomorrow. It takes money to make money, does it not? So that we can bring those energy bill savings down so that we end up spending less than we might otherwise imagine. So the remaining costs of energy services tomorrow, not 2040, year after year, in order to maintain a viable economy so we can generate the resources to do something about climate, the combination of energy efficiency and new energy renewable resources must be able to reduce the real cost of energy services year after year after year in order to maintain anything like a robust economic activity. So let me jump to the end of the story. My colleagues at ACEEE, while I have my own firm, I am still a fellow with ACEEE, the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. 2 years ago put out a report, The Long-Term Energy Efficiency Potential, What the Evidence Suggests. We suggested that reducing energy use by 40 to 60% in the U.S. could be done through efficiency using highly cost-effective investments. Peter's talked about a number of them already. And it could generate up to 2 million jobs nationwide while saving all residential and business consumers a net of $400 billion a year. Or if we thought of it as per capita household, the equivalent of $2,600 per household annually. Imagine the ability to spend that money on something besides energy. The really big insight, instead of tiny increments, yes, we have to start. But all the things we've talked about here today are the exception, not the rule. Leadership requires us to move these wonderful examples we've talked about so they become the norm, the actual ongoing way of doing business. Instead of tiny increments, the U.S. is going to be better off thinking big about energy efficiency rather than relying on the usual set of more costly conventional resources. It might be like this particular slide of the iceberg. I'm asking the question, are we really living more by waste than ingenuity? And remember I said, right now, hard to see down there at the bottom, but we have an anemic 14% energy inefficiency, I would suggest. And because we're so used to that, and we're not used to stepping back, asking bigger and better questions, we tend to think of the efficiency potential as the top of the iceberg. But if we do, in fact, in the spirit of Richard Feynman, step back, we can imagine that the full potential efficiency is the equivalent of 250 billion barrels of oil equivalent in the United States through 2050. Now, how many billion barrels of efficiency for Florida? I've estimated about a 12-year energy supply at current levels of consumption. In other words, over the next 40 years, Florida has the efficiency potential to cut its energy use by at least a third and save money and have that investment driving a much more robust economy, many more jobs. So efficiency, quick order, I'm going to offer just 3 of so many examples if we're really willing to look and act on them. Traffic signals, one of my favorite. Turns out there are about 300,000 traffic signal systems in the United States throughout our country. Imagine how stop and start driving constrains and idling time wastes fuel on the highway. But also imagine retrofitting these systems with smart sensors and dynamic program so that these actually respond to actual traffic flow, so that traffic signals actually reflect the timing of where drivers want to go. And imagine cars that begin to talk to signals and begin to then help you modify your driving patterns so you become even more efficient. That alone could mean 5 to 10% savings on our fuel consumption on highways. Just something as simple as that. The cost? About $10 to $12 per household. The savings? Maybe as much as $150 per household per year, possibly more. One example of a different way of looking at efficiency. Or improving commercial buildings. A little bit dated, but still very timely. A 2000 Department of Energy sponsored study suggested that if all commercial buildings were rebuilt over time, applying a comprehensive package of energy efficiency technologies and practices, both technologies and practices, they could reduce typical energy use by 60%. And then imagine the widespread installation of rooftop photovoltaic power systems converting light into electricity could lead to an average 88% reduction in the conventional use of energy resources. Cost-effective technologies such as feedback and intelligent infrastructure can all be enablers of this kind of scale of success. Or developing what we call intelligent energy efficiency. It's not your father's energy efficiency anymore, but interconnected system, what my colleagues at ACEEE calls intelligent efficiency. Systems that talk to each other, systems that adjust and that alter dynamic flow of where people, resources need to be within building functions. We could reduce energy use by 1/4 of today's level while still maintaining jobs in a robust economy. Our colleagues using technologies and advanced sensors and controls, Schneider Electric, for example, Rockwell Automation, now offers services to manufacturing firms that reduce electricity use by up to 40% and reduce oil and gas requirements by up to 35%. Are others acting on these ideas? Well, consider the work I'm doing with my colleague Jeremy Rifkin in Nord-Pas-de-Calais. That's a former coal mining region, still heavy industry of 4 million people in northeastern France. Working with Jeremy and our partners in the Paris office of Accenture, we developed a master plan for what we call the third industrial revolution, and we suggested that region had the ability to cut total energy use by half by 2050. All remaining energy needs would then be provided by renewable energy resources, also by 2050. They did not shy away when I told them in order to implement this plan, they needed to be thinking about spending €6 billion a year, each year for the next 36 years. They did not back away. Instead, the Chamber of Commerce, an active participant in this plan, hired a financial manager to begin identifying where they can get their first billion. They're acting on it. In other words, they're not backing away because it's a hard job. If my modeling is to be believed, we suggest that among this 4 million people, they can grow their jobs by 165,000 people a year. The master plan was formally delivered and accepted by both the Chamber of Commerce unanimously. In fact, the Chamber of Commerce has adopted as a strategic plan for that region in France, and the Regional Council, their functional equivalent of a state government, at the World Forum for Responsible Energy last October. And again, they did not back down. They're hiring people to get the job done. But what is perhaps our ultimate economic efficiency resource? I'm recalling the comment of early 20th century UK essayist Lionel Strachey, who remarked, and this is unfortunately still true, Americans guess because they're in too great a hurry to think. Or Jerry Hirschberg, who is the founder and former CEO of Nissan Design, who noted, creativity is not an escape from disciplined thinking, it is an escape with disciplined thinking. This picture began to emerge, and Henry Ford, who said, Thinking is the hardest work there is, which is the probable reason why so few people actually engage in it. So with that closing, Maynard Keynes, in the foreword of his book, The General Theory, the difficulty lies not with the new ideas, but in escaping the old ones. So part of the task is how to help provide that leadership, that what is now the exception becomes the norm, to escape the old ideas and understand that both the climate and the economy are at risk because of the huge inefficient use of resources. Or as my artist colleagues suggest, the difficulty is to escape the old ideas by stepping back, asking better questions, and talking with one another so we can build up our mutual enthusiasm to act and take those leadership roles for the well-being of not only Orlando, but for the U.S. and the global economy more generally. With that, thank you very much.
We have time for 2 questions. Do we have any questions for Jim? Yes.
That was really terrific, bringing us into your thinking. So right now in Florida, we're in the midst of a proceeding at the Florida Public Service Commission where every 5 years we set conservation goals over a 10-year horizon. So my question is, would you come back to Florida and talk to our regulators, the Florida Public Service Commission, our big utilities, and even our governor, because currently the big utilities, which cover 75% of the state, are asking to reduce their conservation goals by 99%, 98%, 97%, 87%, so effectively to cut energy efficiency. So what would you say to them, since on defense of them, I went to all-girl Catholic school so I can argue either side of an issue, but in defense of them, our utility regulation incentivizes building power plants. So we have some real getting away from an old way of thinking. So what would you say to those policymakers?
A really good question. In fact, I've had the pleasure of talking with a number of utility executives, and there is one word beginning to emerge in the backrooms. They don't say this too publicly, but that word is disintermediation. It seems like a big word, but what they're really concerned about is the erosion of their customers away from their traditional power supply in a way that threatens their earnings. And I am now working actively with an investor-owned utility and another municipal utility to develop and apply what I call my energy stress test to the utility earning power. And what this idea is, I showed them in one case that a 10% loss of sales from existing customers might translate into a 50% loss in earnings. That scared the bejesus out of them. And there is increasingly a dynamic among those in the utility industry about this concern. They know the business model has to change. We need to move out of the sale of commodities, pulling a profit off of that kilowatt hour, into the value of services that are provided that allow their customers to become partners, become co-investors, collaborators, and pull a revenue stream off of services provided rather than the sale of electricity. It is an ongoing concern. I think you're going to see more and more shifting in that direction. But there needs to be dialogue, and rather than an adversarial proceeding, we absolutely need to engage in open discussion and forthright opportunities that benefit both the utility and the climate and the consumer. Now, when I've been seeing at OUC, I've been quite impressed by what I've been seeing here. That is something really to build on, and I think that kind of dynamic could expand. So the opportunities are huge. It's a question of whether we're willing to change our regulatory models and our business models to focus on services rather than necessarily sale of commodities.
One more question.
You, on one of your slides, you had the dollar value for energy consumption in Florida, and it was $68 billion. I think it's above $70 billion now. Do you have a number for the amount of expenditure for fossil fuels? I mean, the bulk of our energy is, almost all of it is fossil fuel energy at this time. So it's 70 billion total, but some of that expense is for things like fixing the wires when the hurricanes knock them down. But the fossil fuel purchases, do you have a number on that?
I don't have a number, but professional judgment is probably on the order of at least 2/3, something in that order. It's huge. It's huge. In the U.S., we have a $1,300 billion, 1.3 trillion energy expenditure on the order of 2/3 fossil fuels. And the billion you talked about, Peter, That's only 0.07% of the nation's total energy bills. That's why we've got to take the very good work in the 10 cities and elevate it so that it becomes the norm rather than the exception. But fossil fuels on the order of about 2/3 of that, somewhere. I don't know the exact number, but it's huge. Changing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe.